You're about to hear about the day I watched a 25-year-old punk destroy his own father's company because he thought my handwritten Rolodex was outdated. I'm Ken Thompson, 48 years old, and I spent 15 years building relationships that this kid torched in about 15 minutes. The boardroom on the 38th floor always smelled the same: coffee, leather chairs, and that particular scent of money-changing hands. I'd been breathing that air for a decade and a half, working my way up to Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships at Sullivan Hart Holdings. Sounds boring, right? Let me put it this way. When Fortune 500 companies wanted to buy each other, they called me first. See, most people think business happens in spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. That's amateur hour. Real business happens on golf courses, over bourbon dinners, and in conversations that start with, "My grandfather always said." I learned this from my mentor, Bill Crawford, who taught me that a handshake from the right person was worth more than a 100-page contract from the wrong one. That Thursday morning, I was standing by the window going through my handwritten notes for the biggest deal of my career, $3,000. Andrew Sullivan wanted to sell his family's ranch operations to us, and I'd spent 9 months building that relationship, not through emails or video calls, but the old-fashioned way: face-to-face meetings, golf games at his country club in Dallas, and long dinners where we talked about everything except business until dessert arrived. Sullivan Ranch wasn't just another acquisition target. This was 4 generations of family legacy, built from a 200-acre plot his great-grandfather bought in 1923. Andrew's grandfather had survived the Dust Bowl, his father had modernized the operation in the 1960s, and Andrew had turned it into a $4 billion empire. But he was 67 now. His kids weren't interested in ranching, and he wanted to find the right buyer before his health declined further. The key wasn't the $3 billion price tag. The key was understanding what Andrew really wanted: respect for his family's legacy, assurance that the Sullivan name would be preserved, and guarantees that the 400 families who worked those ranches wouldn't be thrown out for efficiency improvements. These weren't line items in a contract. They were promises built on trust. I had all of that trust documented the only way that mattered: in my personal relationship with Andrew, in handwritten notes from our conversations, and in my worn leather Rolodex that contained 15 years of carefully cultivated contacts. Phone numbers that weren't listed anywhere online, private cell numbers written on the backs of business cards from country clubs and charity galas, direct lines to people who made decisions worth billions. That's when the door slammed open. Brad Hamilton walked in like he owned the place, which technically he did. His daddy was VP of operations. This kid was 25, fresh out of Wharton with an MBA that probably cost more than my annual salary, designer jeans, $300 sneakers, Apple Watch, and that particular brand of arrogance that comes from never having to earn anything. It was his first day on the job, and he was already swinging his weight around. "Excuse me," he said, not even looking at me. He was staring at my desk with the expression you'd use to examine roadkill. I set down my notes. "Can I help you, Brad?" "Yeah, you can help me understand why we're still running a business like it's 1995. He pointed at my Rolodex, the same leather-bound contact book I'd been building since my first day at the company. "What is that thing?" "That's my client database," I said calmly. "Your what?" He actually laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that carried across the open floor plan. A few analysts looked up from their computers. "Dude, we have Salesforce. We have CRM systems. We have cloud-based everything. Why are you keeping handwritten cards like some kind of museum piece?" I looked at this kid in his designer clothes and his complete ignorance of how real business worked. Because some relationships can't be digitized, Brad. When Andrew Sullivan calls me at 11 p.m. to discuss a problem with his grandfather's original land grants, he's not looking at a CRM entry. He's talking to someone he trusts. "Trust?" Brad scoffed. "This is 2024, not 1984. Everything needs to be in the cloud, accessible to the team, trackable through analytics. You're creating data silos with this ancient crap. It's inefficient and frankly embarrassing." The room went completely quiet. Junior executives stopped typing. Analysts froze mid-coffee sip. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a public execution. "Brad," I said, keeping my voice level but letting just a hint of steel creep in. I'm meeting with Sullivan in 2 days to finalize a $3 billion acquisition. This ancient crap is why he chose to sell to us instead of our 6 competitors who've been courting him for 18 months. His face turned red. He wasn't used to pushback, especially not from someone his father's generation. I'm the VP's executive assistant, and I'm implementing digital transformation initiatives across all departments. You need to transfer all your contacts to the central system immediately and get rid of that outdated garbage. Corporate policy. No. Just like that. No explanation, no negotiation, no corporate speak. The kid wanted to play power games, but he'd picked the wrong opponent. Excuse me? I said no. I have work to do. That's when he completely lost his mind. You're fired! The words echoed in the glass-walled office like a gunshot. Everyone froze. You could hear the air conditioning humming, coffee makers gurgling, and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. I turned around slowly and looked at Brad's sweaty, triumphant face. You want to repeat that? You're insubordinate and resistant to change, he said, his voice cracking slightly but getting louder. You're blocking progress and refusing to follow. Direct orders. Pack your things. Security will escort you out. I looked at this kid who had just made the biggest mistake of his short, privileged life. He thought firing the project lead 2 days before the biggest deal in company history would make him look strong and decisive. He had no idea he'd just pulled the pin on a grenade that wouldn't explode until he was standing right next to it. Okay, I said. He blinked. He was expecting a fight, maybe some begging, certainly some dramatic resistance. Instead, I snapped my notebook shut, straightened my tie, and headed for my office. That's it? He called after me. No argument? Brad, I said without turning around, you're absolutely right. Standards are important. I'll pack my things immediately. Here's what this 25-year-old business school graduate didn't understand about my Rolodex. It wasn't just contact information. It was 15 years of relationships, built one handshake at a time, phone numbers that weren't listed anywhere online, private cell numbers written on the backs of business cards from country clubs, charity galas, and hunting lodges, direct lines to people who made decisions worth billions, scribbled on cocktail napkins during conversations that mattered. More importantly, it was trust. When you've sat in a duck blind at 5 a.m. with a cattle rancher listening to him talk about his grandfather's struggles during the Depression, you're not just business contacts anymore. You're something rarer in the corporate world. You're friends. My office was a controlled chaos of 15 years' worth of relationship building. Unlike the sterile minimalism of the boardroom, my desk was covered with handwritten thank you notes, photos from golf tournaments, and business cards from people who didn't advertise their services because they didn't need to. There was the crystal paperweight Andrew Sullivan had given me after we closed a smaller deal 3 years ago. A bottle of 18-year-old bourbon from a Texas oil executive whose ranch bordered Sullivan's property. A signed baseball from a Chicago commodities trader who'd introduced me to Andrew in the first place. But the real treasure was that worn leather Rolodex. Every card represented hours of conversation, shared meals, and mutual respect built over years. These weren't digital contacts you could export and import. These were relationships that existed in the spaces between business transactions, in the trust that developed when someone's word meant something. I cleaned out my desk slowly, methodically. Personal photos first, my dad at my college graduation, my golf foursome from last year's charity tournament, then the sentimental stuff, awards, thank you letters, the bottle of bourbon I kept for celebrating closed deals. Linda Foster, my assistant, appeared in the doorway looking like she'd seen a ghost. Ken, is this really happening? Please tell me this is some kind of joke. It's happening, Linda, I said, sliding the Rolodex into my briefcase with the care you'd use to handle a family heirloom. But don't worry about the Sullivan meeting. I'm sure Brad can handle it. He's got Salesforce, right? The sarcasm felt good, but it couldn't mask the bigger picture. Brad had just fired the only person in the company who understood what the Sullivan deal actually meant. What about the heritage clauses? Linda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Texas ranch operations? The grandfather's original land grants? Nobody else knows about the emotional significance of preserving the Sullivan name on those properties. I shrugged, continuing to pack. I'm sure it's all in the digital files somewhere. Of course it wasn't. The real deal, the emotional core of why Andrew Sullivan was selling, existed only in conversations I'd had with him over cigars and whiskey at his ranch. The stories about his great-grandfather betting everything on 200 acres of what everyone said was worthless land. The pride in building something that lasted through 4 generations. The worry about finding a buyer who wouldn't just strip the Sullivan name off everything and turn it into another faceless corporate asset. That stuff doesn't get entered into CRM systems. It lives in trust between people who understand that some things matter more than quarterly profit reports. I walked out past the security desk where William Turner, head of security, was waiting with 2 uncomfortable-looking guards. William had known me for 10 years, had seen me work weekends and holidays when big deals were on the line. "Sorry about this, Ken," he mumbled, clearly embarrassed. "Orders from upstairs." Brad was standing by the elevators with his arms crossed, trying to look important and decisive. "Make sure he doesn't take any proprietary data," he told William. "He's clean, Mr. Hamilton," William said without even checking my briefcase. "He knew me. He trusted me." 2 things Brad would never understand. I stopped in front of Brad and smiled. Not a bitter smile or a threatening one, a genuine smile. The kind you give someone who has unknowingly just handed you a winning lottery ticket while thinking they're giving you a parking fine. "Brad, good luck with the Sullivan meeting tomorrow," I said. "Just remember, his family built that ranch in 1923. They value tradition, loyalty, and keeping your word. I'm sure you'll do fine." His brow furrowed. Something in my tone made him nervous, but he couldn't quite figure out what. The elevator doors closed on his confused face, and I rode down 38 floors thinking about everything that was about to change. Not just for me, but for Sullivan Hart Holdings, for Andrew Sullivan, and especially for Brad Hamilton. I walked 3 blocks to Murphy's Pub, ordered a double Jameson, and sat in a corner booth to process what had just happened. 15 years of building something real, and it ended because a kid with an MBA didn't understand the difference between data and relationships. That's when I made the call that would change everything. I sat there for 30 minutes nursing that double Jameson and letting everything sink in. The whiskey burned, but not as much as the humiliation of being escorted out like some kind of criminal. 15 years of loyalty, and it ended because some kid didn't understand that real business relationships can't be digitized. But here's the thing about getting older. You learn to see the bigger picture. Brad Hamilton thought he'd just flexed his muscle and shown everyone who was boss. What he'd actually done was hand me the keys to the most spectacular revenge in corporate history. See, there was something Brad didn't know about my relationship with Andrew Sullivan. Something that wasn't in any digital file or corporate database. Our families had been doing business together for 20 years. My father, God rest his soul, had helped Andrew's father navigate a federal land dispute back in the 1980s. When Andrew decided to sell, he'd specifically requested me as the liaison, not Sullivan Hart Holdings, me, personally. That distinction was about to become very important. I pulled out my personal phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Not the ranch's main number, not his business line, but the private cell phone he carried in his shirt pocket. "Sullivan Ranch, this is Andrew. Mr. Sullivan, it's Ken Thompson." "Ken, good to hear from you. I wasn't expecting to call until tomorrow to confirm our Friday meeting. Everything still on track?" "Sir, we need to talk. There's been a development." The warmth in his voice immediately shifted to that sharp, focused attention that made Andrew Sullivan one of the most successful ranchers in Texas. "What kind of development?" "I've been terminated." Silence. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. When he spoke again, his voice was ice cold. "Terminated by whom?" "The VP's son, Brad Hamilton. 25 years old, fresh out of business school. Some disagreement about business methods. And who's handling our transaction now?" "Brad Hamilton. He thinks your grandfather's land grants are inefficient legacy assets that need to be digitized and optimized." Another pause. This one felt dangerous. "He thinks what exactly?" "According to him, traditional relationships are outdated. Everything should be data-driven and cloud-based. He fired me for refusing to transfer my personal contacts to their corporate system." I could hear Andrew breathing on the other end. When you've known someone for years, you learn to read their silences. This wasn't confusion. This was controlled fury. "Ken, are you free for dinner tomorrow?" "I'm unemployed, Mr. Sullivan. I'm free all week." "Good. Meet me at the Union Club at 7 p.m. "And Ken?" "Yes, sir?" Don't sign anything with those people, not a severance package, not a non-disclosure agreement. Nothing. Wouldn't dream of it, sir. I hung up and ordered another whiskey. This one tasted like victory. The next evening, I walked into the Union Club wearing my best charcoal suit and the gold cufflinks my father had given me when I made senior director. The Union Club wasn't just a restaurant, it was an institution. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs that had seen a century of handshake deals, and the kind of discreet service that made powerful men feel comfortable discussing sensitive matters. Andrew Sullivan was waiting in the library, holding 2 glasses of bourbon that probably cost more than most people's car payments. He looked exactly like Central Casting would order for successful Texas rancher: silver hair, weathered hands, and eyes that had seen everything twice. "Ken," he said, standing to shake my hand, "you look good for an unemployed man." "Thank you, sir. Good genes and stubborn pride." We settled into leather chairs that were probably older than both of us combined. The bourbon was Pappy Van Winkle 20-year, which told me this wasn't just a social dinner. "Tell me exactly what happened," Andrew said. I walked him through the whole thing. Brad's demands about digitizing everything, his complete disrespect for traditional business relationships, the public firing. Andrew listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or taking a sip of bourbon. "This Brad character called my office this afternoon," Andrew said when I finished. "Told my assistant that you were unavailable due to a family emergency, but that he was fully briefed on our arrangement and ready to proceed." I nearly choked on my drink. A family emergency? That was my reaction. See, if you're having a family crisis, we can delay the closing, show some human decency. But if you've been fired, he let that hang in the air. "That triggers the key personnel clause," I finished. "The deal becomes voidable immediately." "Exactly. So this boy is either incompetent or dishonest, possibly both." Andrew reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick document. "Which brings me to why I asked you here." He handed me the papers. It wasn't an employment agreement. It was a partnership proposal. Sullivan Holdings is looking for a new director of strategic acquisitions. The salary is $280,000 annually, exactly twice what you were making. Equity participation in all deals, full benefits, and a signing bonus that should make up for any lost retirement contributions. I read through the contract carefully. It was comprehensive, generous, and completely legitimate. "The first assignment," Andrew continued, "is finding a buyer for the ranch operations. But obviously not Sullivan Hart Holdings. They've disqualified themselves through their own incompetence." "What about tomorrow's meeting?" Andrew smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. "Oh, I'm still taking that meeting. I want to see this Brad character try to explain our relationship. I want to watch him realize that he fired the only person who could have saved his deal. And after that? After that, you and I find a real company to buy the ranch. One that understands the value of relationships and treats experienced professionals with respect." I looked at the contract again. It was more than just a job offer. It was vindication. It was proof that experience and integrity still mattered in a world increasingly dominated by kids with MBAs and no actual wisdom. "I accept," I said. "Excellent." Andrew raised his glass. "To new partnerships and old-fashioned justice." We finished our bourbon and spent another hour discussing strategy. By the time I left the Union Club, the trap was set. All that remained was watching it spring shut. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. Friday morning. At 9:45, I walked into the lobby of Sullivan Hart Holdings wearing my new Sullivan Holdings Company ID badge and my most expensive suit. I didn't hide in some corner. I stood right there by the security desk, in plain sight, like a ghost returning to haunt the living. The lobby buzzed with its usual morning energy. Executives rushing to meetings, assistants juggling coffee orders, the familiar chaos of a company that moved billions of dollars around like chess pieces. I watched it all with the detached amusement of someone who was no longer part of the machine. William Turner spotted me first. His eyes went wide, then he quickly looked away, trying not to draw attention. Smart man. At 9:58, Brad Hamilton came rushing down from the 38th floor looking frantic. His expensive suit was slightly wrinkled, there was sweat on his forehead, and he had the desperate look of someone who'd spent the last 18 hours trying to figure out how to fake expertise he didn't possess. He saw me immediately. "What the hell are you doing here?" he shouted across the marble lobby, his voice echoing off the walls. Every conversation stopped. 50 people turned to watch the show. "I'm here for the Sullivan meeting," I said calmly. "You don't work here anymore." "You're absolutely right. I work for Sullivan Holdings now." The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might pass out. Christopher Peterson, the CFO, appeared behind him looking confused and increasingly panicked. "What's going on here?" Peterson demanded. "Ken works for the client now," Brad stammered, his voice cracking. "This has to be some kind of corporate espionage. This is sabotage." "Sabotage?" I laughed. "Brad, you fired me for refusing to digitize my personal relationships. I found new employment. That's called capitalism." That's when Andrew Sullivan walked through the revolving doors. The man had presence. At 67, he moved with the confidence of someone who'd built an empire from dirt and wasn't intimidated by glass towers or corporate politics. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, traditional leather shoes that had been resoled more than replaced, and an expression that suggested he was here to settle accounts. He looked around the lobby slowly, taking in the scene. Brad sweating in his designer clothes, Peterson panicking in his $3,000 suit, me standing calm and professional by the security desk wearing my new company badge. "Gentlemen," Andrew said, his voice carrying across the marble like a judge calling court to order. "I believe we have a meeting scheduled." Brad stepped forward, trying to compose himself. "Mr. Sullivan, there's been some confusion about staffing changes. Ken Thompson no longer represents Sullivan Hart Holdings in any capacity." "I'm aware," Andrew said, his eyes never leaving Brad's face. "He represents me now." The silence was absolute. You could hear the air conditioning, the distant hum of elevators, even the traffic outside. But nobody in that lobby was breathing. Peterson tried to salvage something from the wreckage. "Mr. Sullivan, please, this is clearly a misunderstanding. We can bring Ken back immediately. Full reinstatement, promotion, whatever compensation package he requires." Andrew looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Ken, are you interested in returning to Sullivan Hart Holdings?" I smiled. "No, sir. I'm quite happy with my new position. Better pay, better benefits, and most importantly, better management." Andrew nodded approvingly. "Then there's no one here I trust to handle this transaction." He turned toward the door, then stopped and looked back at Brad. "Young man, you called my office yesterday and lied about Ken's status. You told my staff he was unavailable due to a family emergency. That was either incompetence or dishonesty. I don't do business with companies that employ either." Brad's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "But the contract, the terms were agreed to. We have a binding letter of intent." "Letters of intent are contingent on due diligence and good faith dealing," Andrew said coldly. "You've demonstrated neither. Good day, gentlemen." He walked out. I followed him, leaving behind 15 years of my life and a $3,000 deal that had just evaporated in the most expensive temper tantrum in corporate history. In Andrew's car, he chuckled. That was even more satisfying than I expected. "Did you see the boy's face when he realized what he'd done?" "Hard to miss," I said. "What happens now?" "Now we find a real company to buy the ranch. One that values experience and treats people with respect." The aftermath was swift and brutal. By noon, Sullivan Hart's stock had dropped 15%. By close of business, it was down 27%. The business media picked up the story by Monday morning. Failed leadership costs. Sullivan Hart 3BID deal. The board called an emergency meeting Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Brad Hamilton's father had been demoted. Brad himself was quietly let go with a non-disclosure agreement that basically paid him to disappear and never talk about what happened. They tried everything to salvage the deal, called Andrew's office, offered concessions, even flew a delegation to Texas to meet with him personally. Andrew refused to take their calls. When they showed up at his ranch uninvited, his security team escorted them off the property. 6 months later, we sold Sullivan Ranch operations to Palmer Family Holdings, a fourth-generation agricultural company based in Nebraska. They understood heritage. They valued tradition. They respected the handshake agreements that had governed the Sullivan Ranch for 100 years. Final sale price, $3,200,000. $200 million more than Sullivan Hart had offered. As for me, I'm doing just fine. My office has a view of downtown Dallas, a fully stocked bourbon cabinet, and walls lined with thank you letters from clients who appreciate that some things can't be digitized. My Rolodex is bigger than ever, full of people who understand that real business happens between human beings, not computer systems. Last week, I got a Christmas card from Linda Foster. She found a new job at a company that values experience. William Turner retired with a full pension. Christopher Peterson landed on his feet at another firm. Brad Hamilton? Last I heard, he was working for a tech startup in Austin, probably trying to disrupt something that doesn't need disrupting. Sometimes the old ways really are the best ways. Sometimes respect matters more than innovation. And sometimes, if you're patient and play your cards right, the universe gives you exactly the revenge you deserve. That's my story. Hope it was worth the telling.